Welcome to the first lecture in Enterprise Security, CMGT430. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at architecture and the various components that make up enterprise architecture. The reason this is important is because it enables us to take the enterprise apart and look at various components of it and determine whether or not there is risk, determine whether or not we're in line with business strategy, etc. So understanding how to design and review architecture is very, very important. So let's get started. So what is architecture? Well, architecture, first of all, is a conceptual model. It does not include all the detailed technology required to implement systems or a network within an organization. What it does do, however, is brings focus to key areas of the enterprise. And as we go through the lecture, you're going to see what those key areas are. It helps define decision criteria used when designing and managing technical solutions. In other words, it helps us to identify risk and business requirements, and then to come up with technical requirements and security requirements to meet the functional or business requirements. We can take the business strategy and overlay it on top of our architecture to make sure there's a match. Where there are gaps, then we either need to adjust our architecture or go back and have another conversation with the business. In any case, the final business strategy and final technical architecture, the enterprise architecture, should be a very close fit. And again, the architecture consists of various technical blueprints. Remember, the key word here is blueprint. It is something that can be used by network engineers, developers, and security analysts to make decisions, to make day-to-day decisions about technology purchases, configurations, etc. In this slide, we see the various architecture components. Now, all of these components are on equal footing, and they all together comprise the enterprise architecture. The first is the information architecture. Information drives and supports a business. The information architecture identifies required information, how and where to collect it, required processing, what to store, and why we're storing it in the first place, and how users, business partners, customers, and other stakeholders access and share it. It is the blueprint describing how the business functions or will function. In other words, how the business uses information is dependent upon how the business does business. The network architecture consists of all components creating pathways between systems, endpoint devices, and business entities, including routing, switching, and protocols. The system architecture defines all components needed to support business processes. For example, components needed to support payroll include end-user devices, application servers, database servers, and operating systems. The software architecture defines how applications should behave and interact with other applications, including source code constructs. It conceptually addresses inputs to and outputs from each phase of the software development lifecycle. Again, it is conceptual, not functional. And finally is the security architecture. The security architecture design encompasses all the other architectures. It doesn't mean that they all fall within the security architecture. What it does mean, however, is that in every one of the other architectures, security has a presence. It enables solution design that complies with both business and regulatory policy constraints. It is built into each of the other architectures and supports them. The existence of documented security architecture takes much of the daily responsibility for security policy compliance away from the security team and places it on the desks of business analysts as well as network, server, and software engineers. And how that is done, we'll see later in this lecture. Architecture design is based on some basic principles. And it's important to understand these principles before we look at how to put them together and apply them to build our various architectures. Principle 1, documentation. Probably nothing is more important when putting together an architecture than documenting everything. You document all the information you collect. You document your interviews with all of the business stakeholders. You document your interviews with all the technical stockholders. And any designs must be thoroughly documented, including a narrative about why it was designed that way, so that if future changes are made to the architecture, the architect at that time knows what ramifications are connected with making that new change. Principle 2, no plan is foolproof. The Army had a saying, a good plan is only good until the boots hit the ground. So too with architectures. What seems to be a good idea in a conference room is often unworkable in the data center. What is buildable might not produce expected outcomes. So always expect the unexpected. Your architectures and the processes that manage those architectures must be flexible enough. And usually this comes in the form of a really good change management process, but it must be good enough to absorb anything that does not fit exactly into your existing architecture. Principle 3, the same security goal underlies all enterprise architectures, and that is successful business operation is supported by reasonable and appropriate controls. Not controls because they're the latest thing, but what's reasonable and appropriate for the business. And that ensure confidentiality, integrity, and availability in accordance with standards of best practice and relevant regulations. Principle 4, business requirements require translation into forms that technical architecture designers can mold into conceptual models. This is a very important role of the business analyst. So whenever you're working on an architecture, make sure that you're working very closely with all the appropriate business analysts who are bridging the business requirements to technology. Principle 5. It makes no sense to design something that engineers cannot build. For example, existing infrastructure and budget constraints might prohibit certain models. So then why even design those models? Principle 6. Architects who do not clearly understand the business, its mission, and its operations design incomplete architectures. If the architectures are incomplete, they will not be followed, and they become just worthless pieces of paper. Principle 7, use attack trees and other tools and techniques to understand how threats can exploit critical systems and sensitive data. Attack trees enable us to step through an attack using specific threat vulnerability pairs, and we're going to see this in a future week in this class, and determine whether our existing controls and our architecture designs that we're coming up with can properly deal with an attack based on those threat vulnerability pairs. Principle 8. Technical and IT users will avoid complex and hard-to-use security controls. This shouldn't be a surprise to anyone who works in technology. If something's difficult to use, the users just aren't going to use it. If an architecture is difficult to implement, the network engineers, the developers, and other members of the IT department are going to just simply ignore them. Principle 9. Testing models and final architecture implementations must take into consideration design. For example, if a critical vulnerability is found on a system component, but existing controls result in a very low probability of exploitation, what is the actual risk to the business? Principle 10. Ensure architecture constraints are reviewed during the change management process. Here again is change management. Implementing solutions not compliant with architecture design often leads to higher business risk. So make sure that you have a working change management process, and that part of that process is to compare changes to what is designed in the architecture. As changes begin to deviate over time from the architecture becomes again, a worthless piece of paper, and designs don't always come together with designs that are being worked on by other network engineers or by other developers. It's like having a highway coming from east and west, and the people aren't really communicating. They're not working on the same set of plans, and when they are supposed to come together, the highways are miles apart. Principle 11. If the security architecture does not meet all requirements for expected risk outcomes, risk is probably greater than management expects. And finally, Principle 12. Meeting security requirements means the architecture is compliant with regulatory and best practice constraints. However, compliance does not equal low risk. That's very important. Just because we're compliant with something like HIPAA or SOX doesn't mean that we have mitigated risk to an acceptable level. Only risk assessments during and after architecture design and during the SDLCs can measure success in meeting desired risk mitigation objectives. Now let's take a look at each one of the architectures that compose the enterprise architecture. First one, as you may remember, is information architecture. Information architecture arises from business analysis documentation. Again, it mirrors how the business operates and how it measures success. It crystallizes around answers to the following. What information does the business collect? How is it used? How much of it is stored and where? And why is it kept? You're going to see as we go through these bullet points that I ask why a lot. There's a reason for that. Anytime that you're doing design work, you should always question the way the business is currently doing things. Just because they're doing it today doesn't mean that it's still the right way to do it. For example, there may have been a reason or a set of conditions 10 years ago, and a change was made to a business process to accommodate those conditions. However, today those conditions don't exist. Therefore, the modifications to the process, which may add levels of risk to the process, are no longer necessary. So always question anything that seems a little out of the ordinary. How is data collected and why? How is data shared? What are the business information availability requirements? In other words, how long can a system be down, or how long can the information not be available before the business suffers irreparable harm? What confidentiality, integrity, and availability requirements apply? And what is the legal environment surrounding the organization's industry and the data it uses? Legal environment can mean a number of things. First of all, in the United States, it means what laws, local, state, and federal laws apply to the business. For a multinational company, it also means what the political, the social, and the legal environments are in those countries. And they can vary widely depending on whether it's a developing nation or whether it's an industrial nation. So it's very important to understand how those variables will affect your architecture design. Designing network architecture is complex, and what we're going to discover in this slide is only the very, very top of what is a very, very deep topic, but it'll give you the basic ideas. So when we're looking at network architecture, we have to look at location supported. Is it local? Is it campus? Or is it across the country, the globe? What remote access requirements are necessary? Are we going to allow individual employees to work from home? Are we going to allow them to work from coffee shops? Are we going to allow other business partners to connect to our data center? Do we need security zones? A security zone is a network segment within your data center that is controlled based on the highest classification of the data within that zone. What devices are we going to support? Again, what is the business going to allow to connect? What are our wireless requirements and capabilities? Are we going to have all of our facilities to be wireless enabled? And if so, what kind of controls do we want around that wireless access? What are our minimum performance requirements? How fast do we want our satellite locations to be able to access data center? How fast do we want our customers to be able to access it? And what is our maximum tolerable downtimes? So if I have a specific system, it has a maximum tolerable downtime, which is the amount of time that system can be down and not processing information, not providing information to business processes before the company suffers irreparable harm. And sometimes we might lose the entire network. For example, if a worm infests your network and your network isn't properly segmented, you have no choke points to stop it, there's a good chance you're going to have to bring your entire network down to clean and recover. So how long can you be down for that or for some other business continuity event like a fire, flood, etc., before your company is no longer able to recover? Most information work is performed in systems, and systems provide the richest targets for cyber criminals. A system consists of all components necessary to collect, process, store, and disseminate information related to a business process. System architecture begins with capstone requirements that apply to all current and future systems, which is what capstone requirements are, including what mechanisms are allowed for data collection. For example, is all data collected with wired desktops, or will data collection include RF devices, laptops, tablets, and all kinds of wireless and mobile devices? With today's bring your own device, BYOD movement, it's very important to understand what the business is going to allow and what it is not going to allow as far as when, where, and how data is accessed. Which brings us to the next point. Knowing with what external systems, remote or local, your data center can communicate. What security or regulatory requirements exist? What security and performance considerations affect allowed protocols and communication methods? And what business constraints exist? And finally, what are the minimum access control requirements? Are we going to be using multi-factor authentication, single-factor authentication, single sign-on? These things are dependent upon what data is being accessed. And if you look at today's emerging security solutions, all of them are now based on policy. In other words, a specific user is able to access a specific set of data based on what device they're using and where they're using it from and how they're connecting. And that is the future of designing system architecture. In addition to these basic modeling requirements and guidelines, some data classifications might require greater system assurance levels. For example, one set of I/O protocols might work fine for systems managing confidential data, but it might fall short of constraints necessary for restricted data systems. Remember, a system is classified based on the most sensitive data it receives, processes, stores, or shares. And we're going to look at this in more detail next week. Part of system architecture is the use of system or software development life cycles. Most of the information gathered for network and system architectures applies directly to software architecture. However, software architecture constructs unique to internal software design requires separate consideration. Usually, it's poorly designed or written software that provides the open gate for cyber attack. In each phase of an SDLC, risk and regulatory issues impact outcomes, or they should. In other words, in every phase of the SDLC, security should have a role. Software presents the biggest attack surface to potential threats. An attack surface, which is covered in our reading this week in another chapter, consists of entry points, exit points, data channels, and untrusted data items. Most applications include all these attack surface components. Ensuring application security standards and best practice, included in the SDLC, requires a clear picture of what the software environment should look like. The final software architecture provides necessary vision and guidelines. Examples of development standards and best practice are in the reading upon which this slide presentation is based. And that would be your architecture design chapter, and you'll find that in the syllabus and in your course materials. Also in that chapter is a table 3-1, that lists all the different activities where security should be involved in the SDLC. I'm also posting a NIST SDLC wall poster in the course materials, or a pamphlet in the course materials, that will help you. It will help you understand when and where security gets involved, and will help you to explain that to project managers and other management personnel at your organization. Now for the security architecture. The basis for security architecture is the definition of layered defense as it applies to the unique requirements and operational characteristics of the organization. Wow. What this means is that we put in a set of controls that support all the other controls and to help fill the gaps that are always left by implementing a single control. And although the how varies widely across implementations, the what is typically the same. So remember that our architectures are defining what. They're saying, okay, what is it we want to accomplish? What are the outcomes we're trying to achieve? Those are pretty much the same across all security architectures. What's different is how we achieve those outcomes, and that's largely based on the other architectures that we've discussed in this lecture. So if we look at these, the first layer that we come to in this graphic is policy, standards, and guidelines. So before starting on the security architecture, we need to understand management's appetite for risk is documented in policy. If we don't have policies, if management has not stated their desired outcomes for risk, then we have no business designing a security architecture. The security architecture has to be based on policy. And the outcome of security architecture design must fit within those policy constraints. Next is employee awareness. No architecture survives poor employee security behavior. Your employees, as you'll see in the attack surface reading, your workforce is your largest attack surface. In addition to defining controls and infrastructure design, you need to include a map of how you plan to ensure safe employee behavior through training and awareness practices. But relying on employee behavior is always a bad thing. So in addition to that, we need to determine where we can put in technical controls that will enforce policy without employee intervention or without relying on employee behavior, and then use security training and awareness to fill the gaps. Next is in network intrusion defense and access control. How do you plan to prevent unauthorized internal and external access to your networks? This is a discussion about what you plan to do, not how. Whiteboarding possible design scenarios helps work through common and unique challenges. It helps identify gaps. What mechanisms will you use to authenticate subjects? And a subject is anything that is trying to access a resource, which is known as an object. So subjects can be users, computers, software, services trying to access computers, software, services, etc. Is multi-factor authentication a requirement for some or all network access? And how do you plan to identify and react to probable intrusions? Intrusion defense includes detection and response. So at some point, you're going to have to design a response process and train a response team to react to the inevitable intrusion. Next is segmentation. Will you implement a flat network or one segmented to provide extra protection for highly sensitive data or critical systems? Trust me, if you're not segmenting your network, and the network is of any size whatsoever, you're exposing your organization to unnecessary risk. Segmentation begins with creating isolated remote access zones and is a common way to prevent compromise of one system from quickly spreading to all information sources. So you can set up choke points. A choke point is a place on the network where you can either potentially you can remove a segment from the network, an infected segment from the network, so that that infection doesn't go any farther. If you have an intruder that has made it into your data center, you could have choke points that stop all traffic from moving into your highest security segments, depending on the risk, depending on the type of attack. But network segmentation gives you this capability. Not segmenting your network, everything is on a flat, wired environment, and you have very little control over isolating specific segments of it. You end up unplugging the entire network instead. Next is system access control. At this layer, we begin looking at specific system and platform requirements. These are the final lines of defense. What is your approach to authentication and authorization? Is it role-based, mandatory, discretionary, or rule-based? And these are going to be things that we're going to discuss later in this class. Is the proposed solution compatible with your identity management solution? How will you enforce least privilege? How does your design enforce separation of duties? Have you considered need-to-know constraints? How are these controls affected by data center virtualization? Least privilege, separation of duties, and need-to-know were covered in CMGT430, and we also cover them later in this class. The reason it's redundant in this class is because it's extremely important that you understand these, and we're going to dig in a little deeper on how to implement controls to enforce these access control outcomes. Next is anti-malware and host-based intrusion prevention systems. So how will you manage anti-malware solutions? With all, some, or none of your endpoint devices, you need to have some kind of host-based intrusion. So you can either put that right on the device, or you could have as a gateway into a segment or a security zone, an IPS or an IDS, that is part of an overall log management system that will alert you when something is not quite right. So it isn't I am not a firm believer in HIPs. I'd rather have a large, comprehensive security information and event management system that at the network level, but it's a personal preference. It's just something to consider. Device hardening. It's also attack surface management. The most important defense involves hardening endpoint devices. I can't say enough about making sure that your endpoint devices, as servers, end user devices, are locked down. That you've done your best to apply best practices for device hardening. Hardening requires close attention to eliminating all possible vulnerabilities, reducing the attack surface. And one of the best places to start is implementation of an aggressive patch management process. Patches must be applied. That doesn't mean that you apply them the minute that they become available. What it does mean is that you have a patch management process in place that immediately takes the patch and schedules testing, sends it through the change management process, and applies it within a period commensurate with the risk that the vulnerability it patches presents to your network. And in addition to patching, individual device attack surfaces require lockdown. One of the easiest methods is application of vendor baseline security recommendations. You can even download policy from Microsoft for each server type. So how are you going to assess baselines? How are you going to integrate them into future changes and into your architecture design? And next we have business continuity planning and SIEM, SIEM, which is Security Information and Event Management. They are not a layer in and of themselves. However, they are applied across all layers to bring it all together to protect your network and to ensure availability of information for business processes. No layered defense is perfect. So what BC business continuity planning brings to the table is that response, that planning for the inevitable. Your network is going to go, parts of your network are going to go down. A server is going to fail. A network link is going to fail. It happens. What are you going to do about it? How do you react to that? Is it necessary to have a workaround? These are all things that go into business continuity planning. A SIEM is a more sophisticated approach to log management. In many organizations, log management is having some poor person sit down and manually pour through logs. First of all, in a larger organization, that's just crazy. Second, it doesn't give you the big picture. What it tells you is what was happening on a specific device during a specific period. So what happens with these types of log management approaches is they end up being only reactive. The only time somebody looks at the logs is after something happened and they want to reconstruct the incident. With SIEM, what you end up with is you aggregate all of your logs together and then you run them through a correlation engine. The correlation engine takes a look at everything that was going on at a specific point in time and matches it to what it knows about behaviors, how your network usually behaves, how a network under attack behaves based on the type of attack, and can alert you based on that. So you can take logs from your IPSs, you can take logs from your firewalls, from your switches, from your servers, put them all together, run them through the correlation engine, and now you have a proactive approach to dealing with an intrusion. So up to this point, management is directly involved. However, turning architecture into concrete solutions is the responsibility of SMEs, or subject matter experts. You have to convert the abstract concepts into administrative, technical, and physical controls, and that requires training and experience. If relevant SMEs are involved in all architecture design activities, a strong bridge already exists between theory and practice. The danger there is getting off track during system design or architecture design activities, because SMEs have a tendency to immediately want to go to solutions. Architecture design is not about solutions, it is about outcomes. Now, when we're at this point in the process, the SMEs can go for it, and they're going to go out and they're going to try to come up with how to translate these architectures into something usable for the business. Outcomes of security architecture design include the supporting components shown in this graphic. In addition to capstone policies, system or network specific policies often control unique targeted constraints. So remember from CMGT430, there are 3 levels at which we apply policy: issue specific, system, and enterprise. And those policies, if they don't exist when we get to this point, if all we have are capstone policies, then this is a good time for security to take a look at risk, at any gaps in the policies, in the security program, and fill those gaps. So tools include documentation, checklists, and other things that help maintain consistent compliance with architecture design. Standards and guidelines support policies and provide a decision framework for building or acquiring technology to support business processes. Remember, standards are things you have to do. Guidelines give the designers some leeway so that they can pick the best way to achieve an outcome. Standards, again, are required. This is how you're going to get from A to B. This is how you're going to require the outcome. There is no room for creativity. Controls bring abstract incomes defined in policy and architecture to practical solutions. And processes ensure technical teams consistently and effectively use and update policies, tools, standards, guidelines, and controls. So you have policies, standards, and guidelines are created to get from policy to reality, and the controls are purchased, created based on the standards and guidelines provided. If the solution design people always follow the standards and guidelines, they're going to be always compliant with policies, the architecture, and regulatory constraints. So if we've properly designed our architecture, if we've properly put together our security blueprints, the solution designers can go on about their business as long as they maintain compliance with standards and guidelines. They're going to be designing in accordance with management's expectations of risk and with management's expectations of business operational efficiency. So now we have all of our architectures designed, and we can sit back and relax and not have to worry about anything. Not really. Implementations of architecture are optimally effective only until something changes. So what changes our architecture, or what things drive architecture changes? Emerging threats, changes in business processes, and new business technologies. They can cause both architecture design and controls to provide less protection over time, and new controls do not always work as expected. Information related to architecture reviews comes from 4 primary sources as depicted in the graphic. These same sources also serve as input into initial design activities. So any significant change to any one of them requires a close review of whether the existing enterprise architecture still adequately supports what we expected it to support. If not, changes are necessary, and they filter through all architectures and supporting elements. So if we make a change in one architecture, it may not be necessary to change all the other architectures, but we at least have to evaluate the ramifications of a change on and determine whether or not it's going to adversely affect the other components that we've designed. Information from all sources is necessary to effectively measure changing risk. And as we're going to look at next week, and it's the primary focus of the lecture next week when we go into risk assessments and risk management, it is all about taking a look at outcomes and what our current architecture looks like and the current controls we have in place, and determining whether or not they're working as we expected them to work. And if they're not, then we have to go back and make some changes. And those changes sometimes require changes to architecture design. So how do we measure whether things are working as they're supposed to and whether or not people are following our standards and guidelines through clearly documented and practiced processes? We manage risk, and the adherence to all of our design work through tools and processes designed for that purpose. So as shown in this graphic, 3 best practice approaches to measuring and managing security are audits, vulnerability and penetration tests, and risk assessments. Audits ensure employees, both business and IT, follow policies and use existing processes. Auditors identify key controls as standards of compliance and test to see if business and IT practices achieve them. For example, a key control might measure to see if processes and employee actions achieve the policy requirement of disabling user accounts within 24 hours of an employee leaving the company. Using a sample population of former employee records from the human resources system, auditors test to see if all related user accounts were disabled in the required time frame. It's important to understand that auditors do not look at how, they look at what. So if you have a policy and the policy states A, the auditors are going to make sure that A is happening. If A is not happening, they're going to report that it isn't, and then it's up to the solution designers and managers to go out and find out why it isn't. Does a process need a change? Does a control need a change? Our users or our IT staff or users just not following a process? That's perfectly fine, and there's a management shortfall in oversight. So audits are extremely important, both internal audits and having someone come in from the outside and audit. Post-assessment architecture review is critical if the organization intends to maintain consistent levels of risk. As the architecture drifts, so does the overall strength of policies, tools, standards, guidelines, controls, and processes. So again, risk assessments are going to they start out by using the documentation that says, all right, this is the way the architecture is, this is the way these are the standards and guidelines that we follow, and so this is what you should find in your assessment. Now, the difference between a risk assessment or a post-assessment architecture review and an audit is that in an audit, again, they're looking at outcomes. In an assessment, in a risk assessment, we're looking at everything. We're looking at our standards and guidelines. We're looking at vulnerabilities. We're looking for vulnerabilities. We could also engage someone to come in and do a penetration test, which is doing the same thing, following the same process an attacker would follow in trying to get from outside the company to a target, or by trying to get into a corporate structure and try to break in from inside the organization. So no matter how well we design things, we must measure how well what we've designed is working, and we must continuously check to see whether new vulnerabilities are emerging, and we can do that either from scanning with special tools like Nessus for that purpose, and those are always updated for vulnerabilities, for key vulnerabilities. We can also monitor for key vendors of our data center technology to see if they're announcing vulnerabilities. And there are many other places where we can get that information. And we must be conducting risk assessments on a regular basis, and we should conduct risk assessments as part of change management. If a change comes in for approval as part of change management, somebody, and in my experience it was the security team, assesses the change to ensure that it does not elevate organizational risk, that it complies with security policy. And that is a proactive measure, and it prevents us from implementing things that increase our risk and not have to find them later after risk has been present and possibly exploited for some time. That's it for this week, and don't hesitate to ask questions in your individual forum, or give me a call or send me an email if you have any questions at all about the lecture. The important part of this is to make sure that you're understanding these concepts. These are foundational concepts, not just for this course, but also for managing security in your organization or in future organizations for which you may fill a security role.